I've been playing Pillars of Eternity 2, and because I plan on covering it, and there's a lot to get through first, so it's going to take me a while. When it occurred to me that a lot of people, after some research and things like that in the scene, don't necessarily remember or even know, maybe due to their age and things like that, because it has been a while, to be fair, exactly what a CRPG really is. The genre that this game happens to actually be a part of. And I figure that's actually pretty fair, because, like I said, let's be honest, it's been a while since this particular genre has really graced the PC platform in a really major way, except for its fairly recent renaissance. And I thought that might be a kind of an interesting topic for a video. So I decided to maybe talk about what is a CRPG. Why have we seen the recent resurgence of the genre? And what is the C? Why is it a quantifier that is so important? What sets it apart from any other type of role-playing game? And why does it actually need to be a genre? So this is going to be kind of a basic history, I guess you could say, of a cursory history, I should probably qualify, of the genre, and just a discussion on what they even are and why they're important, and why we saw them fade away and then come back. So, to actually qualify the basic question of the video, what is a CRPG? Well, the C stands for computer. It's computer RPG. And a CRPG, in its most basic kind of definition, is a role-playing game that focuses on a party. They're very party-based, so you won't be playing a singular character in any of them. You will be very much a group of people, although you generally get to create at least one character, your main character. Usually no character is more important than any other. In combat or in the story, even if your character is often driving the story, every character has their own individual stories that you will often go down in side quests or in individual character quests, and that are often usually as well written, if not sometimes more so, depending on the game you're playing, than the main quest itself. And going down those stories and figuring out those particular characters' storylines is often very rewarding, in a literal sense, as in you will get oftentimes unique gear and even extra abilities and things for those characters, as well as just in the traditional story sense of you get to understand why they are the way that they are. And you must actually have a party with you, because the combat in these games is often quite difficult. You cannot actually have an individual character that can do everything, because CRPGs are very much based on the pen and paper role-playing style of character building. You will have characters that are good at, say, lockpicking or sneaking, maybe some that are good at arcana, like, identifying and using magical devices like wands and scrolls. Characters that are really good at intimidating people or are really good at sleight of hand skills. But you will not have a character that is extremely good at all of those things. Not a single character. These skills will be kind of divided amongst multiple characters, and you will never actually be able to, have one character that is built to do everything. And in combat, the same thing is very true, only amplified even more so due to the fact that there are even more skills and abilities and spells to keep track of. You will have characters that are very tanky and able to take a lot of damage, and you'll have characters that can deal huge amounts of damage in an area, characters that can deal huge amounts of damage to singular targets, characters that can buff the party, and characters that can debilitate enemies without dealing all that much damage against them individually. But, again, all of these will be specialized amongst various classes, and each character in your party will have to understand their role. Or, that's really the pen and paper way of saying it. In the CRPG way of saying it, you, because you control all of them, will have to understand their roles and apply them correctly in battle. Because if one character doesn't understand their class, or you don't understand how to apply their class in battle, oftentimes the entire class will be unused correctly, and the whole party can collapse due to a singular character not actually understanding and falling into their role correctly. One character not actually falling into what they need to do properly can oftentimes result in the entire thing just falling apart and a combat really not going very well. A mark of a good cRPG, and oftentimes a pen and paper RPG, can often be that an encounter can go just absolutely horrifically in a really funny way, and you just have to like scrappily make your way out of it the best you can. And then sometimes another good mark of one can be that you all just fall into place like a well-oiled machine and just decimate everything in your way the next time, and it's incredibly satisfying and you walk away like badasses. And both of these things can happen in turn with the same characters, just depending on how you actually manage to, well, manage the encounter. Now, CRPGs technically started way back with games like Ultima and Wizardry. Those were really what you would consider some of the first CRPGs, and those both came out all the way back in 1981. However, what I'm really going to focus on in this video is what we consider to be the modern interpretation of CRPGs, which didn't happen until the late 90s, really. And what I mean by that is games like Ultima and Wizardry, those series have been running for a very long time. However, they have a bit of a different interpretation. Although it is based on the same thing that I'm going to be talking about, the kind of way that CRPGs have tended to go since the late 90s have been in a very specific mold that we currently consider this genre to sort of consist of to this day now. And that mold started in 1998 with the release of Baldur's Gate. And Baldur's Gate was sort of a, I guess what you would consider a codifier for the genre. You know, it didn't invent the genre by any means, like I said, 1981, but it did codify it to its current form that it still exists in today. And this is really where the genre gets its name. cRPG, why is this a genre? This is where that question is answered. It's a genre because of this, and this is where the C comes from. Think of it this way. RPGs, role-playing games, take a lot of forms. You got action RPGs, you got JRPGs, you've got like many different sort of subgenres of action RPGs like Diablo or Dark Souls. From Diablo to Dark Souls, there's a huge chasm of various different types of games there. So where do CRPGs actually fit into the role-playing game scene? Well, what they really are is meant to be a direct adaptation to the digital space of pen and paper or tabletop role-playing game rules, hence the C for computer. Because if you think about it, all the way back in 1981, we didn't have a lot of those other types of games yet. So what they really were is basically taking role-playing game rules, which at that time meant Dungeons and Dragons, things like that, pen and paper role-playing games, literal role-playing games, to a computer, hence the C, and make them digital. So as they evolved, and eventually Baldur's Gate came out, what they basically are taking in the closest way that they can the Dungeons and Dragons or other similar tabletop or pen and paper role-playing game rules and transforming them into a video game. So that's why they're often quite difficult, why they're very party-based, just like D&D or similar games, and why they have a lot of story-based quests, a lot of writing that is often, a lot of people that don't necessarily know exactly what they are may get into them and complain about how much they have to read and things like that. There's a lot of reading involved because they are an adaptation of pen and paper role-playing games. So unlike a JRPG or an action RPG, that is what sets the C RPGs apart. They are an adaptation of pen and paper. Hence the kind of what I'm talking about when I say Baldur's Gate codifying the current sort of form of them. Hence the isometric perspectives, these sort of top-down views, the lots of writing, the party-based, the aesthetic, everything about them comes from the fact that they are a pen and paper role-playing game in digital form. Now, with the release of Baldur's Gate also came the release or use of the very well-loved Infinity engine, which was a very impressive engine that became actually synonymous with these types of games at that time. They actually used the Infinity engine for several other CRPGs, like Planescape Torment in 1999, which was an absolutely incredible game, as well as Icewind Dale in 2000. And Icewind Dale got a sequel as well, and Baldur's Gate also got a sequel. I love Baldur's Gate 2, by the way. Really good game. And the Infinity engine basically became so synonymous with these games that you can't really look back and say one without the other. They were basically the same thing at that point because they were so well known with each other. They were very moddable. People could create their own modules and adventures with the games. You know, the Baldur's Gate games were set on the Sword Coast of Dungeons and Dragons, so people familiar with that setting and even like dungeon masters that like to play D&D with other groups would actually use their books and create modules based on the books they had in the same realms and share them with each other and things like that. It made quite a scene. A little bit later, another game was released called Neverwinter Nights. That was an advancement on the engine, and it was now called the Aurora engine. And the Aurora engine didn't last quite as long because things were sort of speeding up at this time. This was 2002 at this point. And Neverwinter Nights was also an absolutely incredible game, and things were sort of advancing in the CRPG scene. And at this point as well, other companies were getting involved because a lot of these games were actually made by the same people. However, the sort of modability and things were still very important to people. People were adding their own adventures and stuff all the time. So these engines were meant to be very modular. And the scene kept going. And also at the same year, 2002, another company called Larian decided to join in and made a game called Divine Divinity, which, yes, is a terrible name. However, it would become very important for reasons you're probably aware of today, but wouldn't be obvious yet in 2002. Divine Divinity was a fairly unique one in the CRPG scene because it didn't feel quite as rigid. It had very free movement, almost Diablo-esque, because Diablo was out at this point, the first one. And it was very different in a good way. It had, like I said, very free-form movement, extremely interactable environments in terms of like physical objects that you could move around and things. It was very interesting for its time. It was genuinely cool, and it got pretty good scores as a result of that. Just its sort of interesting, odd design and its sense of humor, which the company would become known for later on. Now, games like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale and things like that were made by BioWare, who I'm sure you're aware of. And they would go on to actually create another iteration on the Infinity/Aurora engine, which was called the Electron engine, which in 2006 would be used to create Neverwinter Nights 2. And this is where things started to change. Neverwinter Nights 2 was not nearly as well received as the first game or any of the classic Infinity engine/Electron or Aurora engine games, because this, like I said, is where things started to take a bit of a turn in a strange way for the CRPG scene as a whole. Now, Neverwinter Nights 2, one of its first major obvious differences, if you just look at screenshots of it, is that it's 3D. All the other games up to now, more or less, have been isometric 2D games. However, Neverwinter Nights 2 took a completely different step now that it's 2006, new engine, things are changing, and it's 3D. It almost looks like a more zoomed out, slightly different version of something like Dragon Age Origins. And this was not immediately well received. It had a huge amount of variety in what you could do, where you could go, the places, the enemies, the classes, the abilities, just tons of stuff. But it was quite buggy, and it had a couple of other problems as well. It wasn't a horrible game, but it genuinely had a tremendous number of bugs. And it also, the 3D perspective did kind of trip people up a bit here and there because the camera was a bit fiddly. It wasn't just that it was 3D that people didn't like, it was the actual manipulation of your character and the environments and the camera in 3D that was difficult at times. Also, fun fact, the Electron engine that was a, iteration of the Infinity and Aurora engines was also used to power The Witcher, the first Witcher game. Although if I recall correctly, it was altered a little bit at that point. I think the rendering aspect of it was overhauled by CD Projekt Red, but still, it was the same engine, which is kind of cool. Not super important, although you can see some CRPG aspects in The Witcher's gameplay. Not because of the engine necessarily, but just in terms of its mechanics, the DNA is there. So, I did mention that there were some changes. Changes are coming along. That's because really, along the sort of after the 2000s line in CRPG development, things really did start to change. And that comes along with why did they disappear? Why did CRPGs go away? And that really is because of the prevalence of consoles at this point. Consoles were more popular, the PC market started to diminish, and along with games like RTS and Space Sims that we also saw disappear along this time, CRPGs just don't work well with a controller and are very complex on the old graphical engines and things like that, so they also went by the wayside. That's just how it was. I mean, that happened. So we did see certain things change, certain things tried, like, say, the Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance series on PS2, which was an attempt to bring the Baldur's Gate series to a console, which weren't bad, honestly. They weren't Baldur's Gate, but they weren't bad hack-and-slash games. They were kind of interesting. But as a result of the prevalence of the console market rising at this time, the CRPG sort of rush died down. And stayed down for quite some time. We didn't really see any of them. However, in the kind of 2010s, we started to see people wanting more of this sort of thing in a pretty major way. We actually saw Divinity get a sequel, Divinity 2, but it was in a small way. We started to see people want more of this in a small way. We saw Fallout come back as a first-person shooter, but it kept some of its CRPG DNA. It kept its skill checks and its various skills in the background and things like that. It wasn't what it originally was, but it was still... its DNA was there. What it had come from was still obvious. And Fallout New Vegas furthered that even more. We saw, like I said, Divinity 2 come out on consoles, and it wasn't a CRPG anymore, but it kept some of its DNA. We saw the Two Worlds games come out, and although they were heavily flawed, especially the first one, they also had a bit of that. We saw the Elder Scrolls games, especially Morrowind and somewhat Oblivion, keep some of their original, Ultima Underworld influences in the background and remind us where they came from. We saw Deus Ex come back to consoles as well. And just little by little, bit by bit, we saw some of the more hardcore, either CRPG related or just straight up CRPG, branched off franchises coming back to the mainstream or kind of mainstream adjacent places. And we saw games getting more mechanically diverse again, and we saw people kind of lusting for what was, but not just in the corners of the internet and complaining about it, but in actual big store shelves right there in front of everyone. And it was an interesting time because all of this stuff, like Space Sims and RTSs and even CRPGs, actually started to come back to people's minds. And suddenly, Obsidian made a Kickstarter for Pillars of Eternity, a game that was meant to look like an Infinity Engine game, but play like a more modern game, and was, in fact, just a pure CRPG. And it made $80 quadrillion in half a second or something like that on Kickstarter, and ended up releasing and being fantastic. And so here we were, in the modern day, with a brand new CRPG in the classic style that worked really, really well. And then Larian came back with Divinity all of a sudden, with Divinity Original Sin, and it was amazing. We had Tyranny, which was also pretty good. We had Torment, Tides of Numenera, which I think was meant to be like a sort of pseudo-sequel to Torment, but in the Numenera universe, which I don't know anything about, but I've heard was kind of flawed, unfortunately. But again, I don't want to talk too much about that because I genuinely haven't played it. I have no idea what it's like. Which is kind of unfortunate because Torment, Planescape Torment was incredible, and Numenera is a genuinely interesting tabletop universe. But again, I have no idea what it's like. And then Divinity Original Sin 2 came out, which was my favorite game of 2017. That game, I actually need to play more of it because it's incredible. And then now, as you can see in the background, I've been playing Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. And I like it even more than the first game. It's really, really interesting. It's a lot of fun. The writing, I think, has improved. And it's just a really, really good time to be playing these games again and to see them translated in a really good fashion to now, to the present. And it's actually really cool to have, some of the old school people that were originally making them kind of cast their vision to the future, or the present, and make them again. Fallout is my favorite gaming universe, like, of all time. And I wouldn't want to live there, but I actually really want to see a Fallout made. Another, CRPG Fallout. I mean, there's Wasteland 2, which is awesome. But I want to see, a proper Fallout made in that style again. That probably won't ever happen, because Bethesda controls it, but man, that would be awesome. So, I guess finally, the point to make is, why is this important? Why do CRPGs coming back matter, and why does this qualification of them as CRPGs specifically, and not just Western RPGs, because that already exists? Why does that actually matter? Well, for one, them coming back matters a lot, because the more interesting health that we can give the PC platform, and if they can come to consoles and make them work as well, that's all the better. The more players that we can get back and stuff like that, the better, because the PC market is huge, and it's gaining its dominance back, and that's awesome. But we also have a lot of shovelware and things like that on Steam, and the more variety that we can get for this platform that isn't in, just like your average AAA games, the more like middle shelf games that we can get on this platform, the better. And genuinely interesting and good games that come from various developers and publishers around the world, that come from maybe some smaller stuff, not necessarily indie stuff though. I have nothing against indie games. I'm just saying I love a lot of them. I'm just saying not necessarily the really huge EAs and Ubisofts of the world. The middle shelf guys that still want to make things like this with fair budgets, but not like your giant bloated AAA budgets. I love things like that, and we still need a lot more of that. And this is if they want to make some of the things like this, like your CRPGs that happen to kind of fall into those sorts of budgets, generally speaking, because that's sort of where they've always been, then power to them, that's awesome. But also, it comes down to a lot of these niches, these audiences, have never really went away. They've always been here. They've never went anywhere. But they've just sort of been waiting, waiting for their fix. I know I have. And they've been playing games of old, and remasters don't always cut it, Remasters are nice. Remasters of things like Baldur's Gate 2 and Neverwinter Nights exist, and they're good. They have their problems, but they exist and they're good. But the problem is, remasters only work if you want to still play the games that you remember, and the games that you've been playing for years. And to some extent that's fine, but I would also like to play new games in this genre that I've loved for a long time. And if we can incentivize companies to actually make new games in this niche genre that we love and show that these new ideas and risk-taking measures actually pay off, then I think that's a really good thing. And finally, why does it matter? Well, I think nuance in description and analysis is always really important, as you probably know. But one kind of final idea is really that it helps you sound like you know what you're talking about. I mean, just take an example like Fallout, for instance. I absolutely love Fallout. I even like Fallout 4, even though it has a lot of problems. But let's say, for instance, you really don't like the dialogue system in Fallout 4, and I don't. It helps if you know where Fallout actually came from, and you can articulate that you understand the DNA of Fallout as a CRPG series, and that you understand its roots. When you are criticizing the dialogue of Fallout across the series, and your sort of player character's input in it, versus, say, weighing it against the improved combat, for instance, because Fallout 4's combat is actually quite good in comparison to, say, Fallout 3's, which is abysmal. And it helps if you actually understand that, when you're making comparisons like that, to actually make your voice sound like you know what you're talking about, to actually make your voice heard. Because, let's be honest, even though oftentimes Bethesda does deserve it, it is cool just to complain about Bethesda games right now. I'm not saying that they don't have things worth complaining about, I'm just saying that it's really cool to just constantly moan about everything Bethesda does. So it helps if you actually sound like you know what you're talking about, and you can properly articulate your feelings with this sort of understanding to raise your voice above the din of people that are just complaining to complain. And that sort of understanding of the industry and of the history of their games and things like that helps to kind of quiet down any sort of nonsense forms of dissent about what you're saying, and actually have a discussion instead of an argument, which is good. So, yeah, that's why it matters. Understanding and nuance and analysis matters. And that's kind of why I wanted to make this video in the first place, I guess. So yeah, that's what a CRPG is. It's an excellent niche genre that's been around for a very long time, and I think it's absolutely worth having more of them, and hopefully soon I'll be able to cover this one in the background in particular, Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. I've still got a little ways to go before I feel comfortable in actually talking about it, because there's just so much to it, but spoilers, I think it's even better than the first one. If you learned anything from this video, feel free to let me know in the comments below. If you think I'm annoying, you can let me know too. And thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.